North Korea and Japan reached an agreement at high-level talks held in Sweden in May. North Korea agreed to reopen an inquiry into Japanese citizens abducted decades ago, and Japan promised to lift sanctions against the North. Also notable is the fact that the two nations reached an agreement, although the North has made it clear it will not give up nuclear arms. The Japanese government has given a positive assessment to the possibility of North Korea-Japan summit talks. And the North has established a special investigation committee to look into the abduction issue. The interests of neighboring countries have become intertwined as North Korea-Japan relations have made progress. What kind of impact will it bring to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? Will it have a negative effect on security cooperation among Korea, the US, and Japan? On today's Upfront, we discuss the current challenges facing Northeast Asia.
A very warm welcome to everyone tuning in. You're watching Upfront. I'm Na Hyun-kyung.
I'm Yoo Jong-soo.
Now, joining us today in the studio for our discussion is Ambassador for the National Security Affairs at the Foreign Ministry, Dr. Lee Jung-min. Thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Choi Kang, the Vice President of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, as we saw, the topic on the table today is the changing dynamic of North Korea-Japan relations. So let's start off with a very straightforward question.
What are we likely to see first? A summit between Japanese Prime Minister Abe and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, or a summit between South Korea and Japan, or North Korea and China?
I believe personally that there will be a summit meeting between the Japanese Prime Minister and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un rather than a summit meeting between Seoul and Tokyo or between Beijing and Pyongyang. And so, as you know, President Xi Jinping will be visiting South Korea very soon. But I think it is highly unlikely that there will be a South Korean-Japanese summit in the near term. So if there is going to be a summit, it'll be between Tokyo and Pyongyang.
But I disagree a little bit because actually I agree. Actually, there will be a summit between between Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye in coming days. But actually, I think that there could be the possibility of having the summit between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping because they have to celebrate that on July 27th as a victory day. So actually, actually both parties wants to improve their relations. So maybe my guess. Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping summit comes first, then maybe probably Abe and the Kim Jong-un, then maybe the Park Geun-hye and the Abe summit. That's my guess.
And the fact that Xi Jinping is meeting President Park Geun-hye before meeting North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, is that significant here?
Of course, definitely. That's kind of a signal to North Korea from the Chinese side. That's their displeasure with the current regime, and also they try to teach them some lessons about that. So they have to improve. Actually, both China and North Korea needs to improve their bilateral relations very much. But actually, it's kind of tug of war between China and North Korea at the moment.
I mean, we are seeing some changing dynamics between North Korea and Japan for sure. Are Japan's intentions genuine, though, at this point?
Well, you know, Prime Minister Abe, since he's been in office, really wants to have a major diplomatic score. And as you know, relations with the Chinese have been frozen over the senkakus. Relations between Japan and Korea, for example, have been also quite negative for the last several years. And even relations between Tokyo and Washington are not all that great in certain respects. So for Mr. Abe, it is crucial for him to have a major diplomatic score, and the only avenue that he sees is with the North Koreans. The Russians basically had hoped to improve relations with Mr. Abe, but again, the Russian-Japanese relationship has been also put on the sideways. So this is the only game in town. And as you know, for the last year or so, Mr. Abe spent almost all his energy traveling all over the ASEAN countries. And in fact, he has visited almost all of the Southeast Asian countries at least twice. But even then, there has not been a major diplomatic opening. So this is Abe's, I guess, first major victory if he does believe that this will come to fruition.
Okay, I think that's correct. But actually this is abduction issue is one of the key issues Abe has been pursuing for the past, I think, more than 10 years. So actually, he needs to deliver some kinds of actually tangible outcome of his policy in solving this issue. Because actually, from the beginning of his term, actually, he has been emphasizing resolution of the abduction issue. So it is targeted not only to the outside world, but also targeted to domestic audience, to consolidate his power base, and also actually because he's shooting for next term, actually, because next year we will be having the president, actually the LDP party, LDP's actually president elections are coming up. So he needs to further consolidate his power base in the party and also domestic politics.
Would you also agree that his intentions are a little bit more political, geared towards boosting his ratings within Japan?
Yes, but I think that really depends on the success of the Japanese economy. As you know, he started his administration with the so-called Abenomics. And initially there was a spurt of growth in the Japanese economy, but Japan faces longer-term economic stagnation. And I doubt highly whether Mr. Abe will be able to jumpstart the Japanese economy so that he will be able to be remembered as the one person who really ignited Japan's second growth. And so if the economy stalls, and if then as a result, therefore, he has to move outside of the country to basically have a diplomatic, I guess, victory of sorts. And that leaves very little room for Mr. Abe at this particular time.
Yes.
Abe is pushing for the right of collective self-defense because of North Korea, while making a diplomatic ties with North Korea. These two seems to contradict each other. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, what Mr. Abe has said consistently over the Japanese government, which we don't necessarily agree with, is this. The Japanese have a number of humanitarian concerns with North Korea, and they want to deal with that, including the abductee issue. There are some, according to the Japanese, some 860 Japanese who were abducted over the last several decades, including offsprings of those abducted. And so the Japanese want to clear this issue off the table before they are able to normalize relations with the DPRK. But having said that, the Japanese also realize that with the rise of China, growing Chinese power projection in the region, and of course North Korea's WMD threat, this is one of the major reasons why the Japanese are pushing for collective self-defense. So in the Japanese mind, humanitarian issues should be divorced from economic and in more particularly security and military issues. So from their perspective, it is not idiosyncratic. Actually, it makes consistent sense from the Japanese perspective, although I do not agree with that view.
Right. So, but the international community's perspective would be a little bit different.
Because actually Japanese approach toward North Korea on this abduction issue actually undermines the credibility of Japan in dealing with North Korean challenges. Because actually we have various types of North Korea challenges, humanitarian issue, military issues, also regime stability. But actually, Abe just simply ignored the other aspect at the moment, actually, to achieve some kinds of diplomatic legacy of his own. So that actually undermines the possibility of the trilateral security cooperation, actually, which has been pushed by the United States for a long time to revive the trilateral security cooperation. So while Japan is pursuing the collective self-defense right, and then it actually approaches North Korea to solve the abduction issue, actually, it's a contradiction from the international community. But as Ambassador Lee clearly stated, actually Abe's perspective is quite different from the international one.
So what's in it for North Korea then, apart from the obvious economic or financial reasons?
Definitely, actually, they try to drive wedge between this, especially between the U.S. and Japan, also the U.S., ROK and Japan. So actually, there was, despite also some historic problems with Japan, we have been trying to cooperate with Japan in solving this North Korean problem. If they actually drive a wedge between Korea and Japan on this issue, actually North Korea is quite successful. And also, to my knowledge, I don't think there has been substantial coordination and consultation between Korea and Japan on this issue. It was a big surprise, actually, even to the United States.
You know, from Kim Jong-un's perspective, he's been in office for now over 2 years, and he has very little to show to the North Korean people. And as a result, I think by discussing this particular issue with the Japanese government at this time, Kim Jong-un wishes to achieve two basic objectives, in my opinion. The first is he wants to send a very strong signal to the Chinese that if China is not forthcoming with political and other type of assistance, Kim Jong-un has other alternatives, including, for example, opening ties with the Japanese, but more importantly, opening ties with Russia. And so Russia recently signed a major economic agreement with North Korea. They're going to now be trading in rubles with North Korea. And the North Koreans have also promised longer-term engagement, particularly with their rich natural resources, which the Chinese obviously have a huge stake in. And so from Kim Jong-un's perspective, this is sending a signal to the Chinese, you are not my only friend. The second signal, of course, is to the North Korean people. Because as you can see, anti-Japanese sentiment in North Korea is a very important tool, as is anti-Americanism and anti-South Korean sentiment. But by showing that he can work with enemies, he has shown the North Korean people that, look, I'm a little bit different from my previous leaders, such as his father or even his grandfather. So he wants to show that as a younger leader, he has a bit more flexibility on this issue than perhaps Kim Jong-il or even Kim Il-sung.
So would you say there's absolutely not absolutely, but there's not really a chance that China and North Korea will be talking secretly at this point?
Well, I'm sure the Chinese government is always opening communication channels with the North Koreans, but there are some very subtle signals that I'm sure Dr. Che will agree. For example, recently, senior Chinese diplomats as well as army officials have said that they have been very careful. They said the North Korean-Chinese relationship is not an alliance. And they made that very, very clear. So whereas before, so-called semi-governmental officials or semi-official scholars would say this, nowadays, Chinese government officials are saying this on the record. So they're sending a very clear signal that the North Korean-Chinese relationship, as important as it is like any other bilateral relationship. There's nothing special with North Korea.
No, you're right.
And I think that is a very, very major change in the Chinese perspective vis-a-vis Pyongyang.
Because actually they used to maintain a party-to-party, or the military-to-military line, not the state-to-state. The actual statement made by Chinese officials is a big surprise, actually, because a kind of warning to North Korea. So you are not the only our allies. So be careful about your behavior. So I think there's a clear sign coming from China. But the problem, I don't think China has restored the communication channel with North Korea at the moment, at this point in time. They tried, but actually North Korea has not responded back to in a positive way. Actually, both sides are probing the other's position, especially since the execution of Chang Sung-taek last December. So I don't think China has any kinds of dialogue channel or high level or low level or working level at this point of time. So they will be seen, because actually, as I said before, July 27 is the day actually they have to celebrate the victory of Korean War. So maybe to celebrate, maybe Chinese ambassador to Pyongyang will attend some kinds of ceremony, or maybe China will send some high-level official to Pyongyang to celebrate the joint victory in Korean War. That could be the beginning of restoring the relations. But right now, I don't see anything going on between China and North Korea.
So we're talking about many underlying motives here. We have an expert standing by for us in Stockholm, Mr. Linus Hagström. He is from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and he joins us now via Skype. Sir, in your opinion, what seems to be the motives for North Korea and Japan to proceed with this dialogue?
Well, I'm not. I think as for Japan, the abduction issue is one of the most sensitive and also one of the most strongly politicized issues. And Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he has vouched to do his utmost to resolve this issue during his tenure as Prime Minister. But since Abe has been one of the harshest critics of North Korea, I think ironically he might be one of the few Japanese politicians who could actually compromise with the country without being accused as a traitor. As for North Korea, I think North Korea has been extremely isolated in the absence of multilateral talks, and also in the wake of international sanctions after missile and nuclear tests. And North Korea has profited somewhat from this isolation because it has created a space in which North Korea has been able to develop its nuclear program. But I also think isolation is problematic for economic reasons. And I also think that the Kim regime has a history of trying to exploit differences between the US, Japan, South Korea, and other great powers, and trying to keep some doors open while others are closed. So I think these are the motives on both of the sides.
The interests of neighboring countries have been intertwined into these negotiations. If North Korea-Japan relations make further progress, will there be more gains or losses when it comes to security of the Korean Peninsula?
Well, and I think it's a very big if, Japan-North Korea relations would make further progress, I think it would have to benefit security on the Korean Peninsula at large. If North Korea doesn't take clear steps towards resolving international concerns about its nuclear and missile programs, I don't think any agreement between Japan and North Korea would be possible.
Is that a feasible theory, though? Do you also think that North Korea-Japan relations making any meaningful progress here?
Well, frankly speaking, I'm not quite as optimistic as some other commentators. As I said, the abduction issue is very strongly politicized in Japan. And even for Abe, I think it would be extremely difficult to start to give North Korea any benefits unless it was publicly perceived in Japan that the issue had been fully resolved, or that the compromise struck was at least legitimate and that Japan wasn't yielding too much to North Korea. Now, the Japanese definition of what would constitute a resolution of the issue is extremely strict, and I think the North Koreans are most probably either unwilling or perhaps even unable to provide the level of detail requested by the Japanese side. This is why I predict that talks will get stuck at some point in the near future.
I see, and that would bring the two countries back to square one. Thank you, Dr. Hagström, for your time today.
Do you think it is possible Japan and North Korea relationships will be normalized?
Well, it depends. I think if you have a time span in the next 6 months or 12 months, I think it'll be very difficult, because North Koreans want to normalize relations with the Japanese, but the Japanese have many hurdles to cross. For example, even if you're able to resolve the abductee issue to the satisfaction of the Japanese government, then you have the issue of, for example, what do you do with all the unilateral sanctions the Japanese have maintained? So there are 3 major sanctions the Japanese have maintained on North Korea. For example, the transfer of cash and other types of monies to North Korea, the fact that they have basically stopped high-level exchanges or personal exchanges between North Korea and Japan. And third, you have transportation or other naval vessels that go back and forth between between North Korea and Japan. And so on top of that, you have UN sanctions that the Japanese government has to basically agree to as a member of the UN. So if the Japanese want to fully restore or establish ties with Pyongyang, Pyongyang will say, first of all, release all the sanctions, unilateral as well as the UN sanctions, which the Japanese government cannot do. So there's a major hurdle that they have to pass. And of course, the other major issue is you have to satisfy this issue of North Korea's nuclear weapons, which will not be resolved anytime soon. So those are major hurdles that the Abe government has to take into consideration.
Okay, so actually, there are steps to be taken. First of all, you have to establish a liaison office in Pyongyang before having the full diplomatic relations, and then think about the representation of their interests, and then consulate office, and then finally we can think of a mission. So there are at least 4 steps to be taken, as Ambassador Lee mentioned, but there are other issues to be resolved before having all those 4 steps to be implemented in place. So I think it's a long way to go, but we should not underestimate Japanese kinds of adventurism, because when we see, for example, 1972, when they normalized their relation with China,
ahead of the U.S.
Yeah, ahead of the U.S.
Right.
So we cannot totally rule out that kinds of the possibility. But actually, the possibility is quite low because of as Ambassador Lee already mentioned, there's a nuclear issue is pending, and also the UN sanctions are there. So we have to be very patient.
Okay, of course, we cannot overlook Washington's position. The Glenn Davis, who is a special representative for North Korea policy at U.S. Department of State, met with his Japanese counterpart, Mr. Junichi Ihara. After their meeting, the State Department described that it as productive and substantive. What do you think might have been discussed?
What do they mean by those 2 words?
I think, in diplomacy, there are, of course, issues that cannot be made public, and there are public stances that all governments have taken. So I can only speak, as I said, from a public standpoint point of view. I think the American government has maintained a very fine line on the beginning of potential normalization between North Korea and Japan. They have supported it, but they've also called for transparency, which is a very important word, because they do not want surprises coming out of Tokyo. So I think the American government has maintained a very clear-cut position, which is they hope that the abductee issue will be resolved, so that the Japanese government can move on to other issues with North Korea, moving towards ultimately normalization, but not at the expense of the North Korean nuclear issue, or not at the expense of the US, South Korea, Japan security cooperation and not at the expense of the US-Japan alliance. So those are all benchmarks which the Americans want the Japanese government to keep. And I think most of all, they want the Japanese government to basically tell Washington before they make any major move that they should consult with Washington first.
I think so, because actually the U.S. may have delivered the message, you need to consult with us before you are making any kinds of significant move with North Korea, definitely. And also, the key issue was, I think my guess is was whether how far Japanese government will go for in lifting up sanctions vis-a-vis North Korea. So maybe Japan delivered, we are not going to lift up all kinds of sanctions. Maybe it's going to be quite limited in scope. Depends upon the result we are getting, the reinvestigation of the abductee issue. So that's why I think Ambassador Glenn Dave said it's kind of productive meeting. So there's deliver the U.S. message and got some assurance from Japan about Japan is not going to take any kinds of abrupt unilateral measures from now. So that's why I think Glenn Davis said so.
Do you think the U.S. would like to keep tabs on China by controlling Japan?
To a certain degree, that's the way that's been handled by the United States. But actually, this abduction is sort of a separate one. But there's a different dimension. U.S., China, and Japan is a different case. This is about a more strategic game at regional level. But abduction is a more sub-regional level issue or peninsula or purely bilateral issue between Japan and North Korea. So I think that the U.S. Would always emphasize and also the role of China in solving this issue. But I don't know what will the Chinese position on this abduct issue, but China has not made any clear statement on this issue.
Well, the Chinese have said that if the North Koreans and the Japanese are able to move on this particular issue, humanitarian issue, the Chinese government welcomes it. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry has said officially that they welcome a forward movement on this particular issue because if they can resolve this issue, the Chinese hope that six-party talks and other elements there will be a positive payments. And so from that perspective, the Chinese really want to make sure that the Japanese and the North Koreans are able to work together on this issue. I think another potential reason why is because if the North Koreans are able to work with the Japanese, it puts the Americans a little bit in an awkward position. And from a Chinese perspective, that's basically a dividend for the Chinese diplomacy. But they do not want to see a rapid rapprochement between North Korea and Japan because they have their own concerns if that happens. Why? Because it is almost accepting Japan's de facto security role in this region, which the Chinese obviously reject. So they want the Japanese to move with the North Koreans, but not too fast.
So how would Washington be placed in this dynamic?
I think from America's perspective, the biggest issue is, of course, how do you maintain the so-called G2 relationship? And within that context, it's very important to realize that unlike the Cold War, the Soviet Union had no economic interests or leverage with the outside world. In this particular case, the Chinese are not only a potential security threat to the Americans, they're also an economic partner. So there's a huge dichotomy in that relationship. So the Americans have to maintain good ties with the Chinese for economic reasons, but they also compete with China over security issues. And it is on that element that the Americans want to maintain very strong US-Japan relations, including collective self-defense. So the Americans have a very, very difficult puzzle to maintain here in Northeast Asia.
So, I mean, all involved parties, of course, will be trying to get the best out of what's the best for their interests, their respective interests as well. And part of the Stockholm Agreement was for Japan to lift economic sanctions on North Korea that it had imposed in the past. So let's take a look at the details and what actually those sanctions were before we actually move on and discuss more.
Japan imposed unilateral sanctions against the North, separate from the international community. How far do the sanctions go? Japan has 5 different sanctions in place against the North. It bans the import and export of all goods between North Korea, and money transferred to the North must be reported. North Korean nationals are not allowed to enter Japan. North Korean ships are also not allowed to enter Japanese ports, and cargo ships from the north must be inspected. These are the measures that were instituted right after a North Korean missile launch in 2006. But now, 8 years later, discussions surround easing those sanctions. Japan has shown a will to lift financial sanctions as well as measures on personal exchanges and transportation if the North reopens an investigation into the fate of abducted Japanese nationals. Is it right for Japan to make this unilateral decision without consideration of the North Korean nuclear issue? What kind of stance should neighboring countries, including Korea, take?
So what kind of stance should the involved countries should take indeed? Now, if Japan does go ahead and unilaterally lift sanctions, wouldn't that undercut Washington-led effort to solve the North Korean nuclear issue? I mean, the U.S. deterrent capacity in the region will be deterred.
Yes, but
weakened.
this is why I think the Japanese are differentiating between unilateral sanctions the Japanese government imposed on North Korea and UN sanctions passed by the Security Council. So the Japanese government has said from the onset that whatever happens, the UN-imposed sanctions will remain in place until such time those sanctions can be lifted because of progress in the six-party talks. So, but this is a fine line that the Japanese government has to basically take. In other words, if they go too far in lifting even unilateral sanctions, the American government will say, well, what do you expect the Chinese to do? We are asking the Chinese to put pressure on Pyongyang, but if you don't put pressure on the North Koreans, why should the Chinese listen to the outside community? So this is a dilemma that the Americans also basically
That's
confront.
exactly. The U.S. is pushing the more sanctions on North Korea and also asking the China to adopt more coercive measures vis-a-vis North Korea. Actually, Japanese deal with North Korea actually undercut that the U.S. position very much. U.S. always nowadays saying that we need to be very firm on this position. We are not going back to the kind of vicious circle like provocation, negotiation, and reward. Actually, I think as Ambassador Lee just correctly pointed out, Japanese will maintain quite fine line in lifting up this unilateral sanction. Actually, the scope of unilateral sanction is much greater than the UN Security Council resolutions. Actually, UN Security Council resolutions, actually texts are very extensive, but actually we have adopted a very limited number of measures. And we have not gained any Chinese support in enforcing the sanction very much. So nowadays, the United States actually talking about the secondary boycott, but that it was not able to, it's not possible to have that because of there's some reservation coming from this Congress and also because of this relation with China, maybe Chinese entrepreneurs or business will be hurt. So there are some concerns. But actually, there's a strong voice in Washington. It's time for us to adopt more sanctions. But actually, Japanese move in improving the relation with North Korea on abducted issues actually creates some problem for the United States.
So it seems like the one party that actually has nothing to lose at this point is North Korea.
Definitely, actually, it's quite successful. North Korea drive a wedge between the United States and Japan. Also, maybe corresponding to, or maybe justify the Chinese argument. We need to be more flexible in dealing with North Korea. So, starting with this soft issue like abducted issue, and then maybe we can think of the next step. So, I think this is a critical moment. Of course, it seems to me that North Korea has been quite successful. In approaching that.
From Kim Jong-un's perspective, although he is, tactically speaking, he is making some progress. If you look into North Korea's core problems, it is a de facto failed state in terms of economic performance. You have one of the worst human rights records on record, as the UN Commission of Inquiry report has shown. And so I think what Kim Jong-un wants to do is show the outside world that yes, we are being criticized for North Korea's WMD as well as human rights violations, but by moving with reconciliation with the Japanese, we are showing the world we are making progress on humanitarian issues. But over the long term, he's got to make a strategic choice.
That's right.
Which is, do you give up nuclear weapons and open up North Korea to the outside world, or as they want, this parallel track of having economic growth as well as nuclear weapons, which the outside world rejects, including the Chinese.
Do you think the North Korea and Japan talks might be serving as a stepping stone to resume the six-party talks?
In certain respects, yes, but not really. This is basically almost an entirely Japanese-driven initiative. I don't think this was consulted with Washington or Seoul before the Japanese did this. Mr. Abe, as Dr. Che has said, has had a personal political tie with this issue, with the abductee issue, for more than 10, 15 years. So he believes that as the Japanese Prime Minister for the second time, he has to resolve this issue. to show the Japanese people that he is able to do something very different from his predecessors. So he has a personal stake in this. So it is being driven primarily by Japanese politics, not by the desire to resolve the North Korean nuclear issue.
On the other hand, because actually if Japan is able to solve this abduction issue, I think it's possible to separate this issue from the six-party talks. When we had the six-party talks, Japanese delegates always mentioned we need to solve this problem, while the other parties talking about the nuclear issue. So we asked the Japanese side, could you put that issue aside for the time being while we're discussing all these issues? So because I think if there's a progress, if we are able to separate this abducted issue from the six-party talks, it's possible to make some progress. But the condition to resume the six-party talks have not been met yet, because actually we have been arguing that North Korea should prove itself its intention to give up nuclear by doing concrete action. For example, shutting down the Yongbyon facility and then accepting the IAEA's inspection team back to these areas.
But Pyongyang's humanitarian diplomacy also shows that it is being, in other words, with South Korea anyways, a double standard. As you know, there are many South Korean nationals who were abducted by the North Koreans during the Korean War and after. And they have refused to discuss this issue with the South Korean government. But they're discussing this particular issue, abductee issue, with the Japanese. They're a sworn enemy for several decades. So I think this really shows how bizarre North Korean policy can be. On the one hand, they refuse to discuss the most important issue with South Korea, the same nation after all, whereas they are willing to discuss this issue with the Japanese. And so over time, I think we have to emphasize the fact that although we want to make progress on inter-Korean relations, we have got to make sure that the North Koreans also come clean on the abductee of South Korean nationals, including wartime POWs who are still, we believe, alive in North Korea today.
Now, going back to the six-party talks, both of you seem to agree that the dialogue between North Korea and Japan will not really contribute to solving the North Korean nuclear issue or resuming the six-party talks for that matter. But there's one expert who says that it will actually bear fruitful outcomes, and that's Mr. Frank Januzzi, a former U.S. Department analyst, and he joins us now actually. So, sir, you believe closer ties between Japan and North Korea will contribute to solving the North Korea nuclear issue. How so?
Yeah, well, for so long, Japan has been essentially sidelined from the six-party talks because of the very emotional and important issue of the abduction of Japanese citizens by North Korea. But we all know that the six-party talks need cooperation of all the parties ultimately to succeed. So I think it's very important that Japan try to make progress with North Korea on this issue. If they're able to get satisfaction, to get answers about the fate of people like Megumi Yokota, then Japan can truly be a full participant if the six-party talks resume.
Do you believe Japan's independent move might hinder cooperation among South Korea, the US, and Japan against the North?
I think all moves to engage North Korea among the US, South Korea, and Japan should be closely coordinated. There should be constant communication among the partners to ensure there are no surprises. There will be some times when one country or another country takes initiatives to try to reach out to the North to change the negotiating environment. And I think the key is that they should be in constant touch with each other and constant coordination and communication.
What kind of stance should South Korea take considering the current political landscape?
Well, I think that we have a very important summit meeting coming up between Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping. And I think that we should focus on this as an opportunity to bring China more closely into alignment with the US and South Korean position on the Korean Peninsula. And I hope that, in fact, the summit meeting will yield some progress.
And dealing with North Korea has always been a tricky homework for the involved parties. How do we separate humanitarian issues from nuclear ones?
I served as an advisor to Senator Biden and Senator Kerry. And these two guys were always trying to find a way to engage North Korea on the humanitarian issues separate from politics. And it's hard. But we must find a way to do it. When it comes to issues like abductees, food aid, the humanitarian needs of the North Korean people, these should not be mixed up with denuclearization and politics. And in fact, making progress on these tough issues like family reunification visits between the South and the North can actually help improve the overall atmosphere for the nuclear talks.
Okay, so certainly a tough situation there. Thank you, sir, for taking the time to talk to us today. That was Mr. Frank Janussi, CEO of the Mansfield Foundation, also a former U.S. State Department analyst. Now, so what's at stake for North Korea then? Wouldn't Pyongyang be at a loss if better ties with Japan cost the regime to lose what it has with China and South Korea?
Yes, but obviously the North Korean calculus on this is that if they're able to normalize relations, at least theoretically, the biggest payment is reparations. So they're willing to they're hoping to get several $1 billion of reparations payments from the Japanese government to North Korea. So this would be hard currency, which the North Koreans simply won't get elsewhere. But you must remember, this is a one-time deal. You cannot go back to the Japanese over and over again. So this is why I think both sides are basically doing a shadow boxing at this particular time. And although North Korea wants to have normalized ties with Japan, they cannot do so at the expense of their ties, as you pointed out, with the Chinese. And if there's a rupture in Sino-North Korean relations, that will be the worst possible outcome for Kim Jong-un, which he cannot possibly have at this time.
So actually, Kim Jong-un knows very well that the biggest concern China has a regime stability. So actually, he will going to use that card against China while he is approaching the Japan and in normalizing or upgrading their relations with Japan very much. And also, they try to Kim Jong-un will try to isolate North Korea. I mean, the South Korea. Because they drive a wedge between Korea and Japan. While we are talking about trilateral cooperation in dealing with North Korea, actually, maybe North Korea to approach North Japan to drive a wedge, all this country, and ruptures between Korea and Japan over this issue. I think this is North Korea calculus is very clear. So actually, but it has nothing to lose actually. In developing relations with Japan, actually, so there's more gains than
It's a winning situation for North Korea.
Totally, but that would be the next step. We have to see what kinds of moves North Korea will take in dealing with China issue, I think.
What kind of impact will North Korea-Japan talks have on the President Park's Eurasia initiative?
Oh, I think it will have almost no impact.
No.
Because this initiative was one of the cornerstones of President Park Geun-hye's foreign policy platform. And as you know, she went on a very successful trip to Central Asia recently, including Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And one of the reasons why she believes so strongly in this is that you have to normalize the Eurasian landmass. And at both ends of Eurasia, you have Germany that was unified in 1990, but the Korean Peninsula remains divided. So she believes that once the Korean Peninsula is able to be normalized and there's a peaceful progress, then the entire Eurasian landmass will be peaceful at both ends. Now, so if North Korea normalizes relations with the Japanese, will this disrupt the Eurasian initiative? No, because about 80% of this is economic anyways. So the Central Asian countries want South Korean participation in developing their economies.
What about her trust politique, though? Building trust between the two Koreas first before any other foreign countries get involved.
I mean, part of her, the whole, I guess, genesis of trust politique was very, very simple. That unlike previous governments where you had an emphasis on South-North relations and other governments in South Korea emphasized the international dimension, she said you've got to emphasize both. So if we are able to build trust between Pyongyang and Seoul over a range of issues, then we welcome the participation of other countries, including our six-party partners. So this is not either or. So the entire trust politique and confidence-building measure on the peninsula really has to go side by side with confidence building in Northeast Asia. So the two are not mutually exclusive.
So
And
they're
also-
not really conflicting each
No.
other.
I think there's a complementary to each other. And also, actually, I like to put more emphasis on her statement in Dresden, actually, where she mentioned about 3 proposals, and also one of them is a humanitarian issue. So that's actually, ironically or paradoxically, we can utilize this, those Korea-Japan approach on dealing with this by expanding the scope we should talk about all humanitarian issues we have on the Korean Peninsula as well as in Northeast Asia. So there is a chance for South Korea to make some move and also to take some initiative and also putting more pressure on North Korea in dealing with the humanitarian issues.
So what would be a wise move here for Seoul at this point?
I think that we should make it ourselves very clear on our vision for unification and also what we want to do and also post-unification era looks like, and then got the Chinese and every other country's consensus and support in realizing this one. And also, of course, there should be a clear consensus on, first of all, first condition is the denuclearization of North Korea. So how we can denuclearize. Of course, everybody agrees on the objective of denuclearization. The problem is we cannot get a kind of common approach in dealing with that issue. So maybe the United States putting more pressure, put more emphasis on the sticks. China always all carrots. So how we can mix this stick and carrot in a proper way, so we can come up with some kinds of more the common approach toward North Korea to prevent the further this North Korean manipulation of the differences among ours.
You know, but I think just briefly, I think South Korea's foreign policy from this time onwards is going to face a number of huge challenges, regardless of which party is in power in the next several years. The most important is this. We are the only country, I think, not only in Asia, but around the world, where we have such critical ties with the Americans and growing ties with the Chinese. So we have to show the world that South Korea is able to deal effectively with the G2 powers. And if we are able to show this to the outside world, I think it will be a major plus for Korean foreign policy. But on top of that, you've got to have the North Korean nuclear issue, you've got to have relations, improved ties with the Japanese, also make sure that the Americans are not too competitive with the Chinese. So there are so many challenges that South Korea faces. North Korea's WMD, as important as it is one of many issues which South Korea faces.
Well, a South Korea and the China summit will be held soon.
Yes.
And what kind of opportunities might this talk will bring?
I think President Park, this will be her, I think, 5th meeting with President Xi Jinping ever since she took office. And for the entire first term of her office, or single 5-year term, and the first 5-year term of President Xi Jinping, both regimes overlap. And so President Xi Jinping has said on many occasions that the relationship with South Korea perhaps is one of the most important for China today. And the reason is very clear. If you look at China's map, they have borders with 14 countries, and not one of them are an enemy of China, which is a huge plus for the Chinese. But on the other hand, how many are natural friends? This is something you have to wonder. So from China's perspective, it is absolutely important for them to have really deep ties with South Korea, economically, politically, socially, and militarily. And in the longer term, they want to lessen South Korea's dependence on the US and to also weaken the US, Japan, Korea trilateral security, triangle. That is one of China's objectives. But more than that, they really need a strong Asian friend, which the Chinese at this particular time don't have. This is one reason why President Xi Jinping is emphasizing so strongly ties with Seoul.
More than the ties with Pyongyang.
Oh, definitely. There's a clear message sent to North Korea, definitely, because typically, actually, China has maintained this order. Actually, first we have to go to Pyongyang first, then come to Seoul. But actually, this time, China has been resisting the visit of Kim Jong-un for one reason or another. Actually, Xi Jinping decided to come to Seoul first. There's a clear sign that China's displeasure with the current Kim Jong-un regime. But that does not necessarily mean China is going to give up North Korean regime permanently at all. So actually, they want to maintain the good, not actually equidistance, but actually more balanced, more balance between North Korea and South Korea. So actually, we should take this upcoming summit to get the Chinese support on our especially 2 points. One is the denuclearization of North Korea. Second, support for unification. Of course, the Chinese, I think maybe in this summit, China will be doing some kinds of charm offense again, or history issue, but we should be very sensitive. We should be very careful about this history issue. While this coalition where China in dealing with the history issue actually undermines our credibility internationally, also there is actually eliminate any kinds of possibility to improve our relation with Japan very much. So we should be very careful on history issue, but we have to get some Chinese concrete support for this unification policy as well as the denuclearization issue, and also maybe the humanitarian issue, another one.
So all in all, what kind of direction is recommendable at this point for North Korea and Japan?
Well, I'm not here to say to give advice to North Korea or to Japan.
Yes.
But I think for North Korea, for Kim Jong-un, he is consolidating his power. He purged his uncle. It is now into his third year of leadership. It is now time for him to really show the North Korean people what he's made of. He must deliver economic progress. He cannot be building, theme parks and other types of places which doesn't really serve North Korea's longer-term economic interests. Then he must also make progress on the nuclear front, because without denuclearization, none of the 5 parties will be able to restore ties with Pyongyang fully. And that is the burden on Kim Jong-un, and I sincerely hope that he gets the message through bilateral or other means. As for Japan, we have nothing against the Japanese resolving ties with the North Koreans, but not at the expense of US, Korean, Japanese security cooperation, and not at the expense of overall attempts to denuclearize the North Korean nuclear problem.
So actually for both Japan and North Korea, their agreement is quite limited in scope, not actually change any strategic landscape in Northeast Asia. Of course, they try to achieve some diplomatic legacy, but it's going to be quite limited. The core issues are security concerns of all countries in the region. So unless there is a clear resolution on this security front, there is all talks on humanitarian issue will go nowhere. So actually that kinds of message should be clearly delivered. So they should not misunderstand the current deals, the impact upon the other relations. And maybe actually the kinds of the North Korea-Japan deal was kinds of wake-up call for U.S. and Korea. There could be a possibility of weakening of trilateral security cooperation. So that actually serves not just only the North Korean interest. So actually we have to make it clear that for ourselves.
Some raised the concern that Washington may not be comfortable with South Korea's position to dealing with China. And is this a groundless concern, or is it a real concern?
Well, I think U.S. officials have not said that publicly or officially, but American experts and friends have said that perhaps the South Koreans are becoming too close to the Chinese, but the Americans don't feel threatened by this particular move. And we made it very, very clear, the Park Geun-hye administration, that improving ties with China, number one, will never come at the expense of the ROK-U.S. alliance. And number two, whatever we do by improving ties with China will also improve the U.S.-China relationship. But I think the Americans were concerned that because Korean-Japanese ties are in a deep freeze, they may perceive South Korea's relations with China as a counterbalancing move. And that's why the Americans are a bit concerned. So if they have said that, for example, if we are able to improve ties with Japan, and at the same time improve ties with China, that perhaps would be better. Would be no problem at all. So there is that minor perception. One final point that I wanted to make was that, in crisis management, there's what they call a golden time. And those 4 or 5 minutes after a heart attack or a stroke is crucial for the patient's revival. As we look into the Korean Peninsula and as we move towards the so-called unification tunnel, I think golden time diplomacy is going to be very, very crucial. And that means we have to place key guidelines or guideposts in all of the major capitals, including Washington, Tokyo, Beijing, and Moscow. So this is the beginning, I would argue, of South Korea's 4-party so-called diplomacy, much more earnestly and comprehensively than ever before. So diplomacy is going to become much more important for Korea today in the next several years than I would argue in the last 20, 30 years.
I agree. Actually, at this point of time, we need to look at not only one dimension or on one issue at a time. It's more comprehensive review about the security environment and challenges, and also we should be more imaginative in forecasting the future, and also we should be very firm and very visionary in achieving our goals over unification. So I think that maybe unification the issue can bring all the concerned parties together.
So the dialogue between North Korea and Japan certainly will be kept closely, will be watched very closely. Yes. And thank you very much for joining us today and having this conversation. Thanks for your analysis.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of Upfront.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.